A lot of us like science fiction, but personally, I've always found the really old stuff oddly charming in a way that is lacking from newer science fiction. Maybe I just like the retro-futuristic aesthetic. Maybe the naivete of what they thought the future was going to look like is just charming and funny to me. But I think there's a lot of really old and interesting sci-fi that is worth talking about. Now, when you talk about the origins of the science fiction genre, you can go back to Mary Shelley, you can talk about Jonathan Swift, you can go all the way back to the ancient Roman poet Lucian. But I think the point where science fiction really becomes science fiction is Jules Verne. Now, this is a really beautiful collection. I'm not sure if this is real leather, but it looks terrific on my shelf. In here you got 5 Weeks in a Balloon, Journey to the Center of the Earth, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and Around the World in 80 Days. I have not read 5 Weeks in a Balloon, but all of them that I have read are definitely worth reading. But the one I want to talk about specifically is Journey to the Center of the Earth. Now, this is a book about a guy named Professor Liedenbrock, and he and his nephew Axel travel down the throat of a volcano in Iceland and find themselves in this huge, spectacular underground space with all these tunnels, and that might lead all the way to the center of the Earth. And traveling with them also is an Icelander named Hans, who is not a scientist, he's just carrying their stuff for them, their equipment. This is a book that scientifically is pretty dated. We now know that the Earth is not hollow, and there's this whole speech that the professor has about why the center of the Earth probably isn't molten, when of course in real life we know that it is. But the adventure stuff is just so much fun. Sometimes Verne can get a little dry, a little bogged down in the science. Ironically, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea is actually pretty dry, but that's not a problem here. This is a big, grand adventure with all these spectacular set pieces. There's one bit where they find this underground sea where they witness a fight between an ichthyosaur and a plesiosaur. I think it's actually the first work of fiction in which prehistoric animals show up alive in some hidden pocket of the world, so that's fun. The influence of this book on Lost World literature and Hollow Earth literature in particular is impossible to overstate. It's not where it comes from, but it is where a lot of it kind of gets codified into science fiction stuff. The other reason I would recommend this book to everybody, aside from just the fun adventure element, is that I think it actually helped me deal with stress. I think I'm a better and more secure person because of this book, specifically because of the character Hans, who has just this wonderful outlook on taking life as it comes and not stressing out about things beyond your control. This book helped me more than any self-help book ever has. So, big recommendation from me. But maybe you like your science fiction with a little less emphasis on the hard science and a little more of the fiction. And if that's the case, I think H.G. Wells is your guy. Now, when we talk about Wells, we often talk a lot about all the predictions he made that came true. And indeed, a few of the pieces of technology he described do now exist. We still don't have time machines. But when we talk about Wells as prophet of the future, we forget to talk about Wells, the really good storyteller. His books are often scary, they're often funny, they're very suspenseful, they are very thought-provoking, and one of his best, I think, is The Invisible Man. This is a book about a man named Griffin who turns up in the little village of Iping in rural England. And as you can see on the cover here, he's got bandages all over his face, he's got this big heavy coat, and everyone in town wants to know why, and they're prying into his secret. And you can probably already guess what his secret is. And in the first couple chapters, as he's holed up in his room at the inn, trying to come up with a formula to reverse his invisibility, he's pretty sympathetic, kind of. I find myself, whenever I read it, kind of on his side, and I don't want to spoil anything, but as the book goes on, Griffin turns out to be, honestly, one of the most chilling depictions of an absolute sociopath I have ever read. And this book really goes into just the psychological damage of being invisible, being utterly cut off from everyone else, being imperceptible, just how much that would mess you up, and what kind of person would want that in the first place. There's also this really good Claude Rains movie back in the 1940s. It's one of the Universal monster movies. It's not quite as good as the book, but it does a great job. A couple years ago, you may remember there was another Invisible Man movie with Elizabeth Moss. It's good, but it is not really based on the book. It's its own thing, so I won't talk about that too much. But this movie, really good. There's a common complaint about science fiction writing that a lot of these writers have all these great ideas and are great at world building, but can't really write a story, and thankfully that is not true of H.G. Wells. But maybe you want to go in even less of a hard science direction. Maybe you want to go a little bit pulpier. And in that case, I would recommend maybe the greatest pulp science fiction novel of all time, A Princess of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This is the first 3 books in his Mars series. I think there's about 12 of them altogether. In this collection, you've got A Princess of Mars, The Gods of Mars, and The Warlord of Mars. But let's start with Princess of Mars. This is a book about John Carter, who is a Civil War veteran, who, through means that don't make a ton of sense and aren't very well explained, suddenly finds himself stranded on Mars. But fortunately for him, this is the Mars of old. This is a Mars with a breathable atmosphere that can support life. This is Mars with canals of water. And, best of all for him, Mars has lower gravity than Earth, which means that he can jump incredibly high, run incredibly fast, and has super strength. And he'll need all of them because Mars is the planet of war. And right off the bat, Carter is captured by the Green Martians, 4-armed nomadic giants with a warrior culture. They're basically what the Klingons wish they were. And he also soon meets a fellow prisoner of theirs, a much more human-like Martian named Dejah Thoris, who is the princess of the city-state of Helium. And, naturally, she is hot. So right away, she and Carter start planning how to escape, but Carter realizes that he kind of likes some of the Green Martians. There's a lot he respects about them as fellow warriors. And what follows is this grand adventure of monsters, travels across the desert, battles, sieges, sword fights, airship fights, gladiatorial combat. One thing I do want to warn readers about, though, is this book was written quite a while ago, and there are elements of it that don't age super well. I mentioned earlier that Carter was a veteran of the Civil War, and it brings me no pleasure to tell you that he fought for the Confederacy, and it's mentioned that he has owned slaves. So there are moments in the story where I find myself not liking him at all as a main character, but there's enough adventure and enough exotic world building that I can kind of put it out of my mind, my moral qualms with some of the stuff in this book. This book's not going to be for everyone, and if the problematic elements ruin it for you, I don't blame you. But if you are able to get past them, there is a really fun adventure here, and the influence that this book has had on later sci-fi is just enormous. So it's cool to read just to see where all this comes from. Now, so far I've been talking about novels, but personally I actually tend to prefer short stories. And I would like to draw your attention to this little anthology. This is Creatures of Another Age, Classic Visions of Prehistoric Monsters, edited by Richard Fallon. This is a collection of works from the 19th and very early 20th centuries revolving around extinct and prehistoric life. It would not be entirely accurate to call all of this stuff science fiction, because there is some stuff in here that isn't fiction at all. There are articles, there are poems, there are satirical essays using dinosaurs and ichthyosaurs and whatnot as motifs. But there's also some good old-fashioned adventure stories in here. And again, content warning, some of this stuff does not age super well. There's some really good stuff in here too. Specifically, my 3 big favorite stories in here are, there's one called The Crimson Beast by C.J. Cutcliffe Hine, and that's a story about a couple of guys in northern England who find a flooded cave in the hills, and there's something very nasty in that cave. There's also, this is maybe my favorite story in here, The Monster of Lake La Mettrie, which is a weird western involving an elasmosaurus and brain swapping. And if that synopsis doesn't pique your curiosity, I don't know what will. And finally, there's a nice spooky little story in here called The Terror of Blue John Gap by the great Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. So there's some really, really top shelf writers in here for their time period, and it's a lot of fun. Even the stuff that doesn't age super well, I think is worth reading. If you're at all interested in vintage dinosaur reconstructions, like those big silly iguanodon statues in London or the paintings of Charles R. Knight, and if you're ready to take the good with the bad, then this book is a must-read. Now, if you want to go retro, but maybe a little bit less vintage, then I think Cryptozoology Anthology is a lot of fun. This is more of a mid-20th century, let's say, update to the stuff we read in Creatures of Another Age. Strange and Mysterious Creatures in Men's Adventure Magazines, edited by Robert Deis, David Coleman, and Wyatt Doyle. Now, men's adventure magazines were an entire genre of pulp fiction, big from about the 50s till the 70s or so. My dad remembers them as things to read while waiting at the barbershop. And this book is one of a whole series that Robert Deis in particular has been releasing. These are nice collections of some of the most interesting excerpts from this kind of magazine. This one specifically, of course, is focused on cryptozoology, which is the search for unknown animals. So in this book, you will find Sasquatch, you will find the Yeti, you will find a live T-Rex stomping around in colonial New Guinea, you will find giant man-eating birds, you will find fishmen, you will find the kraken that's on the cover. There's one about a giant lizard. Now, much like Creatures of Another Age, this is a mix of articles and conventional narrative fiction. Some of the stuff in here doesn't age super well, some of it's in questionable taste, some of it is surprisingly compassionate and, dare I say, wholesome, some of it is exciting, some of it is weird, some of it is scary, some of it is actually kind of informative, but all of it is sensational, fascinating, and above all, memorable. And personally, I can forgive a lot in a work of fiction if it is at least memorable, and everything in here is memorable. I don't think that a book or a movie or any other work of art necessarily needs to be good to be worth experiencing. And not everything I have recommended to you today is good. Journey to the Center of the Earth and Invisible Man I would actually recommend to everybody, but a lot of this is kind of a mixed bag, like all vintage genre fiction. But that's the fun of it, right? Not all of it's going to be great, but all of it will at least hold your attention and leave some kind of an impact. And really, that's what we're all looking for, right?